Or Jesus, the so-called Christ? What should I do with Jesus?
Crucify him!
Nail him to a tree!
What has he done wrong?
They're crucifying him. Barabbas. They're crucifying the man that took your place. I don't mean your place. I'm not saying you should be crucified.
Our cells are next to each other.
The crowd is picking up. We need to go.
There was a hole in the wall between the cells. I could pull a piece out and see him. I saw everything.
Barabbas. The Romans may have let you go, but they aren't going to let you live.
They beat him. They cursed him. They spit on him. He never said a thing. He never fought back.
Once we get out of town and find someone to treat your wounds...
Did you see what they did to him? His back. That crown. Those thorns.
At least it wasn't you.
Why not? Why not me? Why him?
I don't know why not. But if we're going to leave, we need to leave now.
Stop! Stop talking! Just...
You're right. You're right. He took my place. He took my place. And this changes everything.
Every once in a while, I have confession time with you. This morning's one of those days. When I first graduated from college and got the job in government, I often had to drive all over southern Ohio, and sometimes I drove fast, like really fast. And often, I would pay a significant price for driving fast. And one night, I was on my way home, going through a little town called Williamsport, Ohio. And it's right on one of those state highways where, you know, you're going 55 and then it slows you down to like 30 and then you go 55 and it's 2 a.m. I'm thinking not much is going on there. I see the one light in the town green. And so I just keep it, you know, on 55. Now, Williamsport has one policeman, and I thought for sure he was asleep. And I go flying through town. And sure enough, I look in my rearview mirror, and there are the lights of the Williamsport policeman. Apparently, he had nothing else to do. And he pulled me over, and he comes up, he introduces himself to me, and he says, you know, you were going, whatever I was going, I don't remember, in a 30-mile-an-hour town, and I'm going to have to write you a ticket. I'm like, okay. You know, you're right, I shouldn't have been doing it. And he goes and writes me a ticket. When he comes back, he says, so here you go, and here's how you pay the fine and all that. He says, you know, where do you work? Oh, boy. And I said, well, I work for the government. Oh, what do you work? What do you do? Well, I work for the congressman. Oh, he said. Oh, Give me that back. I'm like, no, I deserve it. I got it. I'll take it. And he goes, no, give me that back. It's cool. And I'm like, no, it is cool. I was driving too fast in this small town, and I'll pay this. And he goes, no, seriously. You don't have to do that. I'll let you off. And I'm like, no, seriously, man. Appreciate what you do. I'll take care of it. Now, I was embarrassed about this probably this morning more for two reasons. Number one, just embarrassed, that I embarrassed myself, my boss, and all of that, and in paying the fine and all that. But then the second thing I'm embarrassed about is that most of you in this room are saying, why did you not give it back to him? Why did you go ahead and pay it? But I think about that, and I think right there in the street, this police officer was willing to pardon me simply because of who I worked for. And I want you to know that all of us who in the Christian faith have been pardoned simply because of who we know, who we work for. And while that is certainly much more significant than a speeding ticket, I want you to know today that the story of Easter is all about you experiencing that kind of pardon in your life where, everything that you deserved is forgiven. And because this story that I want to focus on today, the trial of Easter and the real crime, the real criminals of Easter, because I want to focus on that, and it's really in all four of the Gospels. I didn't want to sit here and read all four versions to you. I'm just going to do my best to narrate it or summarize it for you, just so you have a clear picture of what's happened. Because last week we talked about Jesus is in the upper room having the Passover meal with his followers, and he prays this amazing prayer for them that helps them to understand who he really is, the focus of Easter. And then he moves from there with them to the Garden of Gethsemane where he's going to pray because he knows what he's about to face. And all of his followers he asks to keep a distance and to pray for themselves and for him. And he came back to them 3 times during this prayer time and found them sleeping. And each time was pretty disappointed. After the 3rd time, Judas, his disciple who went to betray him, shows up with the temple guard of the Sanhedrin, the Pharisees, the religious leaders. And they're looking for him. And it's interesting as you read the stories, there's actually 2 accounts that help us understand what happened better, because Judas gave them the clue that the guy they want is the one he kisses on the cheek. And Jesus saw him coming, and Jesus is actually going toward him. They end up really coming toward each other. And Judas gives away that this is the guy. And Jesus looks at the soldiers and says, am I the guy you're looking for? You looking for me? And they let him know he is, and even fell back when he said, I'm the one you're looking for. And it was interesting about the story. In Luke's version of it, Peter thinks that this is the time that they're going to start the final battle, And he grabs a sword and cuts off the ear of one of the servants of this temple guard. And Jesus says, no, we'll have none of that. And he heals him. He puts his ear back on and heals him right there. Now there's a story to tell your grandkids, right? I always wondered about that. Why did Luke include that part of the story? Because, well, number one, he was a doctor, so he probably thought that was pretty cool to see him heal him like that. But the second thing is to point out that Jesus wasn't starting some kind of revolution, some kind of violent rebellion. This isn't what he was all about. And so Luke includes that piece. The temple guard takes him off, and they take him in the night to a guy named Annas, who used to be the high priest. He's the father-in-law of the current high priest, Caiaphas. He has a little meeting with them, even to the point where Jesus simply acknowledges what he said about him is true, and he could go ask anybody, and they'll tell you what he said. And a temple guard slaps Jesus and says, stop disrespecting the high priest. And Jesus is like, what are you doing? All I did was tell him. I just answered his question. They send him off now to the current high priest. Now, here's what's important about this. Going to Annas, the high priest, they went to him first because you weren't supposed to have a legitimate trial at night. That was against the law. But they decide that they really want to kill this guy, and they've been trying to come up with a way to do it. So now they don't want to miss their opportunity. He's disappeared from them before. And so they take him to the official high priest, and now it becomes an official trial of the faith of the temple. And Caiaphas now starts asking him these questions like, are you the Son of God? Are you the promised Messiah? And Jesus, in 3 of the 4 accounts, says, you said it. You said it, not me. But in Mark's gospel, Mark adds to it, but he says, yes, I am. And with that, they think they've got him now for blasphemy. But here's the problem. Jews can't kill anybody. You could break all the rules. They have a lot of punishment, but they don't have capital punishment. And as a result, if they're going to get rid of this guy, he's got to break a law of the Romans, the occupiers. And so they send him to Pilate and say that he's committed treason against the government because he calls himself a king. And that's when we get into this whole encounter with Jesus and Pilate. Now here's the amazing thing about this story. Pilate starts asking him questions. Are you a king? And what's Jesus say? You said it. You said it. And it's interesting, as you get into the interrogation, Pilate really wants to let him go. At one point, his accusers say that he had been in Galilee, and they find out that he's from Galilee, and so Pilate tries to pass him off onto Herod Antipas, who happens to be in town. But that's okay, because Herod's always wanted to meet Jesus. He's heard about, he's popular, and he's got this big following, but when he comes to him, Herod just mocks him, his own guard beats him, and then they send him back to Pilate, not my jurisdiction. And so now Pilate's got him a second time. And he keeps going in and out to Jesus and then to the people, and then to Jesus and then to the people, back and forth with they say and you say, and he's so confused, and his wife's telling him, you want nothing to do with this guy. I had a bad dream about it. And even when the people said to Pilate, crucify him, he says he's the Son of God, it said Pilate was very afraid. Because he says he's the Son of God, and his wife's had this dream, and he's pretty much not sure what to do, and he comes to this moment where he's got to make a decision. I could be standing before the Son of God, but I'm also standing before a whole lot of insurrection and a lot of political and social pressure. And so ultimately Pilate sentences him to be crucified. Now, there's how the whole story went down. The arrest, the accusations, the 2 essential trials that he had, all in that night. And all then through the next morning. And we come to this and we say, what do we get from this whole story? I mean, what does this have to do with me? Well, I guess when you read it, and honestly, I'd encourage you, sometime over the next couple weeks as we're celebrating Easter together, go to every gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and read the whole story of the Passion Week or Easter in each one. Get a big picture of it, because here's what you find out. We're not really sure. Well, yes, we are. Who was the criminal and who was the judge? Because you see, the interesting thing about this story is that the accusers are really the accused. That's what I want you to get here. I mean, if you brought a Bible, we're going to, as you know, we've been doing this out of John 18 and 19. And I want to encourage you to turn there. If you brought a Bible or you have a device, you can go to Southland Guest and you could find the Bible app and go to John 18, because we're really focusing on this, but really the whole story is what's important to us. And I want you to get it here now. Here's the whole idea. The interrogation of Jesus focused on 2 accusations. What were they? He says that he's the Son of God, or he's the Messiah. That was the first accusation, which, by the way, was true. Then he also says that he's a king. Are you a king? Pilate says, which, by the way, was also true. And so Annas, the father of the high priest, says it this way when he first asks him about his teaching and his followers. See, Annas is already worrying about the following that Jesus has. And are these people going to start this revolution and this rebellion? And I think Annas honestly would have liked to have been part of that, to get the Romans out of there, not realizing that the rebellion would have been against him as well. And standing before him, he asks him about his teaching and followers. And here's what Jesus says. John 18, verse 20. Get this. I've spoken openly to the world, Jesus replied. I always taught in synagogues or at the temple where all the Jews come together. I said nothing in secret. So why question me? Ask those who heard me. Surely they know what I said, and it's here that the temple guard slaps him in the face for disrespect. And he looks at him and says, look, all I did was respond to the question. All I did was tell you the truth, and you hit me? Why? Well, the bottom line is because these Jewish leaders didn't like the pressure he was putting on them. They didn't see him as the Son of God, the Messiah. They didn't like what he was doing and the following he was having. So they had to come up with these charges, and that's when they gave him to Governor Pilate. Now you've got essentially the accusers being the accused in the religious body, and now we're going to shift to the government. And the government is the same way. Luke tells us, first of all, he tries to pass him off to another jurisdiction. So we see the government playing with each other here, and Herod and his officials mocking him and saying, I'm not going to mess with this guy. They know the following that has come behind Jesus. And yet a lot of those followers, well, were just that. Just following because he was popular. And now here he is, accused by both the religious and the political power of his day. And it's interesting, in both cases, Jesus was innocent of the charges, and yet they brought false witnesses to try to trump up some evidence against him. And here's what it says in John 19:6. Here's what Pilate declares. You take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him. See, here in this moment, Pilate has concluded that the guy didn't do what they said he's doing, and he could have set him free, but the political and social pressure was just too great. What does this mean for you and me? Well, let's make sure we understand what it means for them. The Jews couldn't find any crime or sin Jesus had committed. They wanted him dead and lied. Pilate found no crime, but sentenced him to death. Those who accused Jesus were guilty of themselves, and the accusers were really the accused. And men and women, the Bible tells us, and we know this throughout history and watching people's lives totally changed, is when men and women in the world understand that they are accused of sin, that each one of us has broken the laws of God, that failed. We've disappointed ourselves even. It's at that point that you begin to understand what this trial is all about. You ever heard of a countersuit? You know, when you sue somebody and you have all this against them, well, they believe that they're innocent, and so they sue you back for the defamation that your lawsuit is causing, the damage your lawsuit is causing. You got one suing the other, and everybody's suing each other, all because one thought they were innocent. The bottom line is today is all the world is made up of Caiaphases and Pilates, all guilty of sin when he isn't. And everybody wants to go back and forth and act like they're innocent when in their heart of hearts, they know. You know. There's disobedience, rebellion, brokenness, failure in your life. Stuff that you wish you would have never thought, let alone taken action on. And you realize that while you've tried to defend yourself before others, in your heart and before God, you know you're accused. And that's why we recognize now that we are his accusers as well. We're right there with Caiaphas and Pilate. You know it. You've messed up. You failed. And here's the interesting thing about the story. It's that Jesus has this opportunity, right, to make a statement, to give a testimony, and yet Jesus' defense was really no defense at all. It's interesting in both of these trials how Jesus just agrees with what they say about him. Yeah, you're saying it. Ask anybody. You can ask anybody out there. They know what I've said, and I know what you're saying. And then there they are asking him the question, are you the Son of God? And only in Mark's gospel does it say that he answered, I am. But most of the time he referred to him as saying, you said it, not me. Ultimately, in every interrogation, Jesus acknowledges the questions and lets the questioner answer it for him. Now think about that. Look at it here in John 18:36. Here's how Jesus replies. Pilate asks him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Here's what Jesus says. "My kingdom's not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place." And so Pilate then tries to declare it for him. I mean, he's got to have something to get this guy on. So he just says it out. "You are a king then." And Jesus replies, "You say that I am a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." What did we say last week? The focus of Easter is that Jesus is God himself in the flesh, now standing before, imagine you're him, Pilate. And here he is. You're not sure, you don't know, you're not allowed even to believe this, and yet you want so much to let him off because you know there's something wrong with this whole scenario. And you look at him. You could let him go, but you don't. You don't. Now, it's interesting how Jesus says, the reason I'm in front of you right now isn't about what you think. I came to this world not to be a political king. I came to this world on a mission to show everybody the truth about themselves and about God. That's why I'm here. That's it. And when you think about it, here's Jesus' opportunity to testify, and he says very little. It reminds me of when I was working for the congressman. We'd go to these editorial boards at newspapers, and they'd ask him all these questions to try to get him to say something that was juicy and they could trip him up. And he'd always told me before we'd go in, he'd say, "Steve, always remember this. If you're talking, you're losing. If you're talking, you're losing. Remember that in your marriages. If you're talking, you're losing." But now listen, here's what he meant. He meant, look, let them do the talking for you. They'll declare it. They'll say it. And the fact is, this is what Jesus was all about. His preaching, his miracles, his compassionate activity, all of that spoke for him. And that's why he says, ask others. Ask others what I've said. He could have avoided prosecution, maybe even execution, if he'd have just said the right thing to Pilate, but instead he didn't, because he wasn't trying to avoid prosecution. He wasn't trying to avoid execution. Men and women, he was choosing it. He was choosing execution. And he did it for a reason. Because Jesus' sentence was really our sentence. That's what we need to understand. He was taking our sentence upon himself. You know, it's really interesting when you read some of the leaders of the early church and the letters that they wrote, the epistles that they wrote. For instance, Paul wrote a letter to his friends in Rome, and in chapter 5, verse 8, you can read it there if you want. Here's what he said. "But God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us." I mean, that's the reality, is that none of us can save ourselves. God knew this. Yet he longs for this loving relationship between us. And yet because we were guilty, he took our guilt upon himself. I mean, Peter actually, in his letter, this is probably why, one of the reasons why Jesus healed the guy's ear. Peter had stuff to do. He didn't need to be arrested. Here's what he said, chapter 2, verse 23. "When they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the cross, so that we might die to sins and live for righteousness. For by his wounds, you've been healed." You know, it's interesting, actually, Peter is quoting Isaiah the prophet there when he was talking about the Messiah. By his wounds, you and I are forgiven. Our relationship with God is restored. Our brokenness is mended. All death is conquered by his wounds. Everything we deserve, he took upon himself. There's a lot Jesus could have said or done at the trial. There's a whole angel army he could have called in to defeat or conquer those who were accusing him. But you see, the real criminals in this case, he loved them too. And it's interesting that he ultimately would become their judge. Because of the love of God, Jesus took it all of it. He chose it all. The ridicule, the mocking, the false testimony, the beating, and ultimately the death sentence we deserved. He took it all upon himself. You know, I always wanted to explain this when I was a youth pastor. I always wanted to explain it well, and someone shared this kind of illustration with me, and it made a lot of sense. Now, just so you know, this is an audience participation illustration. So you have to engage, all right? Stay involved. There are 4 characters in this courtroom scene. And first in comes the judge, and the judge is God. So let's all hear it for God, all right? Let's applaud. Woohoo! Yeah. I see the enthusiasm. All right. And then in comes the defendant. That's you and me. Oh, wow. That's your response when you hear you and me. Oh, wow. Okay, come on. Oh, wow. There you go. Now you're grabbing, all right? Now, then in comes also the prosecuting attorney, and that's Satan. There we go. Somebody already set it up for us. Boo. All right, we got to hear it. Boo. Yeah, thank you. And then, of course, in comes the defense attorney, and that's Jesus Christ. So let's hear it for Jesus Christ, all right? Now you got it. When you hear their names, you have to have the proper response so you'll stay engaged. But so we come to this case, and you and I take the stand. Okay, you're catching on slowly, but you're getting there, right? And the first to get up and interrogate us is the prosecuting attorney, Satan. There we go. And he looks at you and says, "You're a sinner." Yeah, well, okay, you can go with "oh, wow" there, because that's probably what you've been saying. And then he looks at God, the judge. And he says, "And you said all sin deserves death." Oh, wow. And with that, he sits down. And you and I, oh, wow. We're sitting there going, because he's right, and I'm going to die. And then the defense attorney gets up, Jesus Christ. All right. And Jesus looks at you and I, and he says, he's right, you're a sinner. Oh, wow. And you're saying, I thought you were on my side. What's up with this? And then he looks at the judge, God himself. There we go. And he says, Judge, Dad, and you're feeling better about it right now because he's got this relationship with the judge. And he says, and he's right, all sin deserves death. Oh, wow. And Jesus says, but let's be clear. The verdict isn't not guilty because he's guilty. But I already took all of his execution, his sentence, upon myself. And so while he is guilty, I took his guilt for him. I took his punishment for him. So the verdict should be case dismissed. And he sits down. That's what I'm talking about. This is the reality. Jesus at his trial is not interested in getting off. Jesus at his trial is interested in taking your punishment for you. That's the whole reality of the Christian faith. That's what we know is to be true. And by the way, remember last week we talked about he proved it with his game, not his words? His resurrection is what proves that all of this is true. And all of it is true for you. Because that's why it's not just another trial. He's not just another historical figure. No, he's the Savior of the world, and he's your Savior. Because what you deserved, he took upon himself. And here's the interesting thing. If you press rewind, we talked about it last week, and go back to John chapter 1, right at the very beginning of his gospel. In verse 12, he says it this way. But as all those who receive him, to those who believed in his name, He gave them the right to become children of God. In other words, he's saying it's not just something that you acknowledge in your head that happened and is true, but you actually receive his grace, receive his mercy, receive his forgiveness, and make him the leader of your life. But you know, someone who takes all of your punishment upon himself because he loves you, and then he dies and rises from the grave, pretty sure he could be trusted with your life right now. And men and women, that's what it means to not just celebrate Easter, but experience Easter.